in the glittering halls of Greystone Manor, Heiress Eleanor Fairchild vanishes during a grand ball, leaving only a sapphire necklace and a whiff of chloroform. As whispers of foul play ripple through the guests, Miss Jane Marple, a spinster, unravels a web of secrets, deceitful charm, hidden tunnels, and a fortune at stake. With a cunning lawyer, a debt-ridden cousin, a loyal butler, and a mysterious guest under suspicion, can she uncover the truth before it's too late? Chapter 1. The Ball at Greystone Manor. The great hall of Greystone Manor glowed with a warmth that belied the chill October night beyond its ancient stone walls. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen cascades, their light dancing across the polished oak floor where couples twirled to the strains of a Viennese waltz. The air was thick with the scent of hothouse roses and the murmur of cultured voices, each guest a jewel in the crown of the county's elite. At the heart of it all was Miss Eleanor Fairchild, the young heiress whose fortune was whispered to rival that of royalty, and whose beauty, a cascade of auburn hair and eyes like summer skies, drew every gaze. Tonight was her annual ball, a tradition begun by her late father, and the manor thrummed with life. In a shadowed corner, near a table laden with champagne flutes, sat Miss Jane Marple, her slight figure almost lost in the grandeur. Her black lace dress, modest yet elegant, spoke of a bygone era, and her nimble fingers worked a pair of knitting needles with quiet precision. She had come at the insistence of Lady Beatrice Langley, Eleanor's aunt, a formidable woman with a penchant for sensing trouble where others saw only merriment. "Something's not right, Jane," Beatrice had confided that morning over tea in St. Mary Mead. "Eleanor's been ... distant, and that household too many secrets." Miss Marple, whose sharp eyes missed little, had agreed to attend, her curiosity piqued by the hint of unease in her old friend's voice. Now, as she watched the swirling crowd, Miss Marple's gaze was not on the dancers but on the undercurrents beneath the polished surface. She noted the butler, Mr. Giles, moving with the stiffness of a man carrying more than trays of canaps. His eyes darted too often toward the grand staircase. Mr. Roland Fairchild, Eleanor's cousin, cut a dashing figure in his tailored evening suit, but his laughter rang a touch too loud, his hand lingering on the champagne. The family lawyer, Mr. Clarence Vaughan, stood apart, his lean frame rigid, his cold grey eyes scanning the room as if tallying assets rather than guests. And then there was Lord Ashby, a late addition to the guest list, whose easy charm and vague tales of foreign ventures drew clusters of admirers, yet left Miss Marple wondering what lay behind his polished smile. Eleanor herself was a vision in ivory silk, her sapphire necklace a Fairchild heirloom catching the light as she moved among her guests. She paused to laugh with a dowager, to dance with a colonel, her grace effortless yet somehow strained. Miss Marple, whose village life had taught her to read the smallest gestures, saw the flicker of tension in Eleanor's smile, the way her hand brushed her necklace as if it were a tether. She's playing a part, Miss Marple thought, her needles pausing for a moment. But for whom? The clock struck 11, its chimes swallowed by the music. Eleanor excused herself, murmuring about a need to adjust her necklace, and slipped. Up the staircase, the ball continued, oblivious. Miss Marple's eyes followed her, then drifted to the faces of those who had noticed her departure. Giles, adjusting a silver tray, glanced upward. Roland, mid-sentence with a debutante, faltered. Vaughan's lips tightened, almost imperceptibly. Lord Ashby, leaning against a pillar, raised his glass as if toasting her absence. 20 minutes later, A scream shattered the revelry. It came from upstairs, sharp and raw, cutting through the waltz like a blade. The music faltered, then stopped. Guests froze, their faces a tableau of shock and curiosity. Lady Beatrice, her face pale, emerged from the staircase, her voice trembling. "Eleanor, she's gone." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her heart quickening not with fear, but with the familiar stir of a puzzle. As the crowd buzzed and Inspector Harrow, summoned from the nearby town, began barking orders, she rose. Quietly, Greystone Manor, she sensed, was about to reveal its secrets, and she, Jane Marple, would be there to unravel them. Chapter 2. The empty room, the great hall of Greystone Manor, so recently alive with the whirl of dancers and the lilt of violins, now stood hushed, its grandeur dimmed by the weight of uncertainty. The guests, their finery incongruous against their anxious whispers, had been herded into the drawing-room like sheep under a storm cloud. Inspector Harrow, a burly man with a moustache that seemed to bristle with impatience, had taken command, his voice booming orders to the footmen to secure the exits. His presence, meant to reassure, only deepened the unease, for his reputation in the county was one of haste rather than precision. Miss Jane Marple, seated near a marble fireplace, her knitting needles clicking softly, observed the scene with the calm detachment of one accustomed to human folly. Lady Beatrice Langley, her face drawn, had insisted Miss Marple accompany her to the heart of the investigation. Sensing that her friend's quiet wisdom might pierce the fog now enveloping Greystone, "Miss Fairchild has vanished, Inspector," Harrow announced to the assembled guests, his tone implying that the fact itself was an affront to his authority. "No one leaves until we've searched the premises and questioned those closest to her." His eyes swept the room, lingering on the four figures who stood out like pieces on a chessboard. Mr. Giles, the butler, whose rigid posture belied a nervous twitch in his jaw. Mr. Roland Fairchild, Eleanor's cousin, slouching against a bookcase with a glass of brandy he had somehow procured. Mr. Clarence Vaughan, the family lawyer, whose thin lips were set in a line as unyielding as his starched collar, and Lord Ashby, the enigmatic guest, who leaned casually against a window frame, his smile as polished as the glass behind him. Miss Marple's gaze, however, was drawn upward to the grand staircase where Eleanor had last been seen. Lady Beatrice, clutching her arm, whispered, "Jane, you must come with me. Her room, it's all wrong." The inspector, overhearing, grudgingly allowed Miss Marple to join the small party ascending to Eleanor's private quarters, though his scowl suggested he thought her presence superfluous. A village spinster, she overheard him mutter to his sergeant, "What use is she in a case like this?" Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. She had heard such dismissals before, in St. Mary Mead and beyond, and they only sharpened her resolve. Eleanor's bedroom, at the end of a long corridor adorned with portraits of stern Fairchild ancestors, was a vision of opulence. The four-poster bed, draped in damask, stood untouched, its pillows plumped as if awaiting their mistress. A vanity table gleamed with silver-backed brushes and a crystal perfume bottle, its stopper glinting in the light of a single lamp. The sapphire necklace Eleanor had worn, a family heirloom said to be worth a small fortune, lay coiled on the vanity, its stones catching the lamplight like a frozen sea. The window, framed by heavy velvet curtains, was latched tight, its panes unmarred by cracks or smudges. The door, too, showed no signs of forced entry, its lock intact. Yet the room felt hollow, as if its very air mourned the absence of its occupant. Inspector Harrow paced the Persian rug, his boots thudding with purpose. She was here, adjusting her necklace, the maid says. Then poof, gone. He gestured theatrically, as if Eleanor had dissolved into the ether. No struggle, no blood, no broken glass. It's unnatural. His sergeant, a wiry young man, named Betts, nodded vigorously, scribbling in a notebook. Lady Beatrice, wringing her hands, recounted how her niece had excused herself from the ball at 11, citing a loose clasp on her necklace. The maid, Jenny, a pale girl trembling in her apron, confirmed she had seen Eleanor enter the room but had left her alone to return to the kitchens. Miss Marple, moving quietly to the vanity, bent to examine the necklace. Its clasp was secure. Not a hint of damage. She straightened, her eyes narrowing as she caught a faint, acrid scent near the curtains. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the velvet, and inhaled. Not perfume, as Inspector Harrow assumed when she pointed it out, but something sharper, medicinal. Chloroform, she was certain, though she kept the thought to herself, for now. In St. Mary Mead, she had once encountered a similar scent when a local chemist's assistant had been careless with his supplies. The inspector, sniffing dismissively, declared it some lady's fragrance and turned to question Jenny further. The maid's story was simple, but Miss Marple noted the girl's hesitance, the way her eyes flicked toward the door as if expecting someone to enter. Did you see anyone in the corridor, Jenny? Miss Marple asked gently, her voice as soothing as a vicar's at tea. Jenny shook her head, but her fingers twisted in her apron. No, miss. Just the guests downstairs, and Mr. Giles giving orders. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the maid's unease. Servants, she knew, saw more than they admitted, often out of loyalty or fear, as the inspector barked questions. Miss Marple drifted to the wardrobe, its doors slightly ajar. Inside hung a cascade of gown silk taffeta, lace butt. One hook was empty, a faint outline of dust, suggesting a garment recently removed. She glanced at the floor, where a single pearl earring lay half hidden beneath the bed. Not a pair, just one, its mate presumably still with Eleanor. Miss Marple knelt, her knees protesting, and retrieved it, turning it over in her fingers. It was a small thing, but in her village, small things often led to great truths. Anything of note? Miss Marple. Inspector Harrow's tone was impatient, but Lady Beatrice's hopeful glance urged her to speak. Only this earring, she said mildly, holding it up, and a curious scent by the curtains. Perhaps the room holds more than we see at first. Glance. The inspector snorted, but Bates scribbled diligently. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the window, its latch secure but its frame old, the wood slightly warped. She made a mental note to examine the exterior later, when the inspector's attention was elsewhere. The search of the room yielded little else. No hidden panels, no scrawled notes, no signs of a struggle. Yet the absence of evidence was itself a clue, Miss Marple thought. A woman like Eleanor, vibrant and beloved, did not vanish without intent, hers or another's. As they descended to the drawing-room, where the suspects awaited, Miss Marple's mind turned to the four men. Giles, with his years of service, knew the manners every corner. Roland, drowning in debt, might see fortune as his salvation. Vaughan, with his legal grip on the estate, held power few others did. And Ashby, the outsider, brought an unknown element. His charm a mask that might hide anything in the drawing-room. The guests' murmurs had grown restless, their faces pale under the gaslight. Inspector Harrow began his interrogations, starting With Giles, the butler stood ramrod straight, his voice steady as he recounted fetching wine from the cellar during the critical hour. Miss Marple, seated again with her knitting, noted the faintest tremor in his hands, the way his eyes avoided the inspector's. Roland, next, was flippant, claiming he had been flirting with a Miss Carrington on the terrace. Miss Carrington, blushing, confirmed it, but her hesitation suggested she had not been entirely focused on Roland's charms. Vaughan, cool and precise, said he had been in the library, reviewing papers for Eleanor's trust. No one could confirm or deny it, for the library was secluded. Ashby, with a disarming laugh, described a stroll in the gardens, admiring the moonlight. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The gardens had been dew-soaked that morning, yet his shoes, when she glanced at them, were pristine. Each alibi was plausible, yet each had a crack, like a teacup with a hairline fracture. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, her mind weaving a pattern from the threads of their words. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a grocer's boy had claimed to be in one place while his muddy boots told another story. People, she knew, were careless in their lies, leaving traces as clear as footprints to those who looked closely. Lady Beatrice, hovering nearby, whispered Jane, "What do you make of it?" Eleanor's roommates, as if she was never there. Miss Marple patted her friend's hand. She was there, Beatrice, and someone else was too. The room is too perfect, like a stage set for our benefit. She did not mention the chloroform, nor the earring, nor the missing gown, but her mind was already turning over possibilities. A kidnapping, perhaps, but not for ransom. Eleanor's fortune was tied up in trusts, accessible only through legal maneuvering or her own consent. Or was it a flight, staged to look like an abduction? Eleanor's strained smile at the ball suggested a woman under pressure, but from whom? As the inspector dismissed the guests to their rooms, under strict orders to remain on the estate, Miss Marple lingered by the fireplace, her knitting a shield against curious eyes. She watched Vaughan adjust his cufflinks, a gesture too deliberate for a man at ease. Roland's brandy glass was empty again, his nonchalance fraying. Giles, directing. The footman moved with a precision that felt rehearsed. Ashby, catching her eye, offered a nod and a smile, but Miss Marple saw the calculation behind it. Like a card sharp gauging his opponent, the manor settled into an uneasy quiet, its corridors dark save for the flicker of gas lamps. Miss Marple, escorted to a guest room by a nervous maid, sat by the window, her knitting idle now. Outside, the grounds stretched into shadow, the gardens and greenhouse barely visible. She thought of the warped window frame, the chloroform's faint trace, the single earring. Someone planned this, she murmured, her voice soft as the night, and plans, like village gossip, always leave a trail. The clock in the corridor chimed midnight, its echo lingering like a warning. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with purpose. Greystone Manor was a puzzle, and she, Jane Marple, was no stranger to puzzles. Tomorrow she would look closer at the grounds, at the suspects, at the secrets hidden in plain sight. For now, she tucked the earring into her reticule and turned down the lamp, her mind as sharp as the needles resting in her lap. Chapter 3. The suspects assemble the drawing-room of Greystone Manor, with its high ceilings and walls lined with somber portraits, felt like a stage set for a tragedy. The morning after Eleanor Fairchild's disappearance cast a grey pallor over the estate, the sky outside heavy with clouds that mirrored the mood within. The guests, confined to the manor by Inspector Harrow's orders, milled about with the restless unease of caged creatures, their whispered speculations buzzing like flies. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair near a bay window, her knitting a steady rhythm against the tension. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, moved from face to face, noting the small gestures that betrayed more than words ever could. Lady Beatrice, her face etched with worry, hovered nearby, occasionally pressing a handkerchief to her lips as if to stifle a cry. Inspector Harrow stood by the fireplace, his broad shoulders squared as if to bear the weight of the case alone. His sergeant, Bates, flanked him, notebook in hand, his pencil poised like a soldier awaiting orders. The inspector had summoned the 4 men most closely tied to Eleanor Meister Giles, the butler, Mr. Roland Fairchild, her cousin, Mr. Clarence Vaughan, the lawyer, and Lord Ashby, the enigmatic guest who faced questioning before the assembled household. "We'll have the truth out of them," Harrow had declared to Betts, loud enough for Miss Marple to overhear. She doubted it would be so simple. Truth, in her experience, was like a shy village girl, coaxed out only with patience and care. The room hushed as the 4 men entered, each distinct in bearing yet united by the shadow of suspicion. Giles, in his impeccable black livery, stood, with the rigidity of a man drilled in duty. But Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, unusual for one so composed. Roland slouched in with a studied nonchalance, his tie slightly askew, a cigarette dangling from his fingers despite the hour. Vaughan, lean and precise, carried himself like a blade sheathed in silk, his eyes scanning the room as if assessing its occupants for weaknesses. Lord Ashby, by contrast, entered with a lightness that bordered on insolence, his smile as disarming as a summer breeze, yet Miss Marple sensed a steel beneath it, like a charm she'd once seen a travelling salesman wield to mask his sharper intentions. Inspector Harrow cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Miss Eleanor Fairchild vanished from her room last night, leaving no trace but a necklace and an earring. Someone in this house knows more than they've said. I'll have your accounts now, and mark my words, I'll spot a lie." His tone was gruff, but Miss Marple thought it lacked the finesse needed to unravel a tangle as intricate as this. She adjusted her knitting, her fingers steady, her ears attuned to every word and pause. Giles was called first. He stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back, and spoke in a measured tone. "I was in the cellar, sir, fetching a case of claret for the ball. The guests were numerous, and the wine was running low. I was there from 10:30 until—" The scream was heard. His voice was steady, but Miss Marple's eyes flicked to his boots, polished to a mirror shine, yet bearing a faint smudge of earth knot, the dry dust of a cellar, but something damp, like the soil of the manor's grounds. She recalled a St. Mary Mead gardener whose boots had once betrayed a late-night escapade. Giles's alibi, she suspected, was not as airtight as he wished. Roland followed, tossing his cigarette into the fireplace with a careless flick. "I was on the terrace, charming Miss Carrington," he said, his grin half-hearted. "We talked of horses and Paris, you know, the usual fluff. I didn't see Eleanor after she danced with that dull colonel." Miss Carrington, seated among the guests, blushed and nodded, but her eyes darted to Roland with a flicker of uncertainty. Miss Marple noted it, remembering a village lass who'd once covered for a bow, only to falter when pressed. Roland's debts, whispered about in the county, hung over him like a storm cloud. Had they driven him to something desperate? Vaughan's account was delivered with the precision of a legal brief. "I was in the library reviewing documents for Miss Fairchild's trust," he said, his voice as cold as the marble beneath his feet. The ball was no place for such work, so I sought solitude. I saw no one, and no one saw me. His isolation was convenient, Miss Marple thought, for the library's seclusion made his story unverifiable. She noticed his cufflinks, gold and engraved, glinting as he adjusted them, a gesture that seemed more nervous than he intended. In St. Mary Mead, a bank clerk had once fidgeted similarly when questioned about missing funds. Vaughan's control, she sensed, was a facade. Lord Ashby was last, his tone light, almost amused. I took a turn in the gardens, admiring the roses by moonlight, he said, spreading his hands as if offering a gift. The ball was splendid, but I needed air. I returned when I heard the commotion. His shoes, Miss Marple observed, were spotless, despite his claim of wandering the dew-heavy gardens. She thought of a St. Mary Mead poacher whose clean boots had once undone his tale of a midnight walk. Ashby's charm was a shield, but what did it conceal? The inspector pressed each man, his questions blunt as a hammer. Did you see Miss Fairchild after 11? Did you hear anything unusual? The answers were consistent. No, no, and no. Yet Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, heard the cracks in their stories, not in what they said, but in what they did not. Giles's earth-stained boots suggested a path outside the cellar. Roland's reliance on Miss Carrington's vague corroboration left room for doubt. Vaughan's solitude was too perfect, his demeanour too controlled. Ashby's garden stroll, unmarred by dew, rang false. Each man, she thought, was like a character in a village drama, playing a role but leaving clues in their performance. Lady Beatrice, seated beside her, leaned close. Jane, they all sound so certain, yet I feel they're hiding something. What? Do you see? Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with a faint smile. People, Beatrice, are rarely as clever as they think. They speak, but their hands, their eyes, their boots, they tell another story. She did not mention the chloroform she'd scented in Elinor's room, nor the single earring, nor the missing gown. These were threads in a tapestry she was only beginning to weave. Inspector Harrow, satisfied for now, dismissed the men but ordered them to remain on the estate. The guests dispersed to their rooms, their whispers trailing like smoke. Miss Marple lingered, her gaze drifting to the portraits on the wall's Fairchild ancestors whose stern eyes seemed to watch the unfolding drama. She thought of Elinor, her strained smile at the ball, the sapphire necklace left behind. Was she a victim, or had she played a part in her own disappearance? The chloroform suggested force, but the untouched room hinted at calculation. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once solved a theft by noting what was not stolen, a lesson she applied now. The necklace, left in plain sight, was a distraction, perhaps, from something less obvious. As she rose, her knitting tucked into her reticule, Miss Marple caught Vaughan's eye across the room. He held her gaze for a moment, his expression unreadable, then turned away. She felt a chill, not of fear, but of recognition. In her village, a solicitor had once looked at her thus, when she'd come too close to his secrets. Vaughan, she suspected, was a man who planned, and plans were dangerous things. The manor's clock struck noon, its chimes solemn. Miss Marple, escorted by a footman to her room, paused at the corridor's end, her eyes drawn to a narrow window overlooking the grounds. Beyond the gardens, the greenhouse glinted faintly, its glass panes catching the weak sunlight. Something stirred in her memory, a tale from St. Mary Mead, of a hidden place where secrets were kept. She would walk the grounds later when the inspector's men were occupied. For now, she retired to her room, her mind as busy as her needles had been, piecing together the first threads of a mystery that promised to be as intricate as any she had faced. Chapter 4. The Butler's Tale. The late morning light filtered through the tall windows of Greystone Manor, casting long shadows across the polished floors of the servants' quarters. The air was heavy with the scent of beeswax and the faint tang of coal smoke, a reminder of the fires stoked to ward off the autumn chill. Miss Jane Marple, having excused herself from the drawing-room's stifling tension, had ventured below. Stares at Lady Beatrice's suggestion. Talk to Giles, Jane, Beatrice had urged, her voice low. He's been with the family since Eleanor was a child. If anyone knows the manor's pulse, it's him. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the wisdom of those who served, agreed. Servants, she knew from St. Mary Mead, were the unseen threads that held a household together, and their eyes missed little. The pantry, where Mr. Giles was found polishing silver, with a fervour that bordered on obsession, was a narrow room lined with shelves of gleaming cutlery and crystal. The butler, a tall man with greying temples and a face carved from duty, paused as Miss Marple entered, his cloth halting mid-stroke, on a tarnished spoon. His eyes, dark and guarded, met hers with a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by his customary deference. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice as crisp as his starched collar. "May I assist you?" She smiled, her demeanour as gentle as a village aunt offering tea. "Oh, Mr. Giles, I hope I'm not intruding. Lady Beatrice thought you might share a word about Miss Eleanor. Such a shock, her disappearance." She settled onto a stool, her knitting produced from her reticule as if by instinct, the needles clicking softly. Giles resumed his polishing, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the spoon a fraction too tightly. "I've served the Fairchilds for 20 years, he began, unprompted, as if reciting a creed. "Since Miss Eleanor. Father was master. She was a bright child, always kind to the staff. I'd have given my life to protect her." His words were fervent, yet Miss Marple caught a tremor in his voice, a note of something unspoken. She thought of a St. Mary Mead butler who had once sworn loyalty to a family, only to be undone by a secret he could not confess. "You were in the cellar last night, fetching wine, I believe?" she asked, her tone light, as if discussing the weather. Giles nodded, his cloth moving faster. "Yes, ma'am. The claret was needed for the ball. I was there from 10:30 until the scream." His alibi, delivered to Inspector Harrow earlier, was unchanged, but Miss Marple's eyes drifted to his boots. They were polished, as expected of a man of his station, yet a faint smear of damp earth clung to the heel, distinct from the dry dust one might expect from a cellar. She recalled the manor's grounds, wet with dew the previous night, and her mind turned over a new thread. "The cellar must be quite a labyrinth," she remarked, her needles pausing. "All those old passages beneath the manor. Do they lead anywhere, I wonder?" Giles's hand faltered, the spoon clattering softly against the table. He recovered quickly, but not before Miss Marple saw the fleeting panic in his eyes. "Just storage, ma'am," he said, his voice a touch too firm. "Barrels and bottles, nothing more." She nodded, as if satisfied, but her mind was elsewhere, picturing the manor's underbelly, its forgotten corners where secrets might hide. She shifted the conversation, her voice as soft as the wool in her hands. "Miss Eleanor trusted you, didn't she? You must have seen her grow into the woman she became." Giles's face softened, a rare crack in his armor. She did, ma'am. She'd come to me as a girl, asking about her father's stories, the manor's history. Lately, though, she seemed ... troubled. He stopped, as if realizing he'd said too much. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her silence an invitation. Giles hesitated, then added, "She asked about the accounts last week. Odd questions, about trusts and such. I told her to speak to Mr. Vaughan." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained placid. Trusts, she knew, were the lifeblood of a fortune like Eleanor's, and Vaughan, as the lawyer, held the reins. How curious, she said, almost to herself. And did she seem anxious about these matters? Giles shook his head, but his eyes avoided hers, fixed on the silver. "Not anxious, ma'am, just ... determined." The word hung in the air, and Miss Chifley, the housekeeper, chose that moment to bustle in, her apron rustling. "Giles, the inspector wants the staff lists," she said, her tone sharp. Giles nodded, his relief palpable as he excused himself. Miss Marple lingered, her gaze settling on a row of keys hanging on a hook by the pantry door. One, slightly tarnished, bore a label, "Cellar." She made a mental note to inspect it later, when the household was less alert. As she rose, thanking the housekeeper for her hospitality, she caught sight of Giles through the pantry window, hurrying across the courtyard toward the stables. His stride was purposeful, not the gait of a man merely fetching wine, she thought, of a St. Mary Mead stable boy whose hurried steps had once led her to a stolen bicycle hidden in a shed. Where, she wondered, was Giles going in such haste? Returning to the main house, Miss Marple encountered Inspector Harrow in the hall, his face red with frustration. No ransom note, no footprints, no nothing, he grumbled to Bates, who trailed him like a shadow. "This case is a ghost story." Miss Marple, pausing to adjust her shawl, said mildly, "Ghosts, Inspector, often leave traces, if one knows where to look." Harrow's scowl deepened, but he waved her off, muttering about meddling amateurs. She smiled to herself, accustomed to such dismissals. In her village, the local constable had once scoffed at her insights, only to thank her later when a thief was caught as she climbed the stairs to her room. Miss Marple's mind sifted through the morning's gleanings. Giles's loyalty was genuine, but his boots told a different story, and his mention of Eleanor's questions about the trusts was a thread she could not ignore. The cellar, with its labyrinthine passages, might hold more than wine, she thought. Of the chloroform scent in Eleanor's room, the single earring, the missing gown clues that pointed not to a random act, but to a plan. Giles, she suspected, knew more than he said, but whether he was culprit or pawn remained unclear in her room. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting idle as she gazed at the grounds below. The stables, where Giles had gone, lay beyond the greenhouse, their roofs just visible. She recalled a village tale of a servant who, loyal to a fault, had covered for his master's misdeeds, only to find himself in. Giles's devotion to Eleanor was clear, but devotion, she knew, could blind as well as bind. As the manor's clock chimed 1, she resolved to visit the cellar before dusk, when the inspector's men would be distracted by lunch. For now, she tucked her knitting away, her mind as sharp as the needles, ready to unravel the next knot in Greystone's mystery. Chapter 5. The cousin's motive, the afternoon sun, struggling through the heavy clouds over Greystone Manor, cast a fitful light across the library, where shelves of leather-bound volumes loomed like silent sentinels. The room, with its scent of aged paper and polished oak, was a haven of quiet amid the manor's restless atmosphere. Miss Jane Marple, having slipped away from the main house after her encounter with Giles, had been invited by Lady Beatrice to join her in the library, where Mr. Roland Fairchild was said to be lounging about like a cat in the cream. Miss Marple, her knitting in hand, saw opportunity in the invitation. Roland, with his easy charm and whispered debts, was a figure of interest, and the library, where Clarence Vaughan claimed to have been during Eleanor's disappearance, a stage worth examining. Roland Fairchild sprawled in a leather armchair by the fireplace, a glass of brandy cradled in one hand, a cigarette smouldering in an ashtray beside him. His dark hair, slightly tousled, and his tailored suit, now faintly crumpled, gave him the air of a man who cared more for appearances than substance. Yet his eyes, when they met Miss Marple's as she entered, held a flicker of wariness, like a village lad caught pilfering apples. "Miss Marple," he drawled, rising with a lazy grace, "come to join the Inquisition. I assure you, I am as innocent as a choir boy." His grin was disarming, but Miss Marple, accustomed to such charm from St. Mary Mead's more roguish residents, returned a smile that was polite but unyielding. "Oh, Mr. Fairchild, I'm no inquisitor," she said, settling into a chair opposite him, her needles clicking softly. "I only thought to enjoy the library's quiet. Such a fine room, and so central to last night's events." Her tone was mild, but her words were a probe, and Roland's grin faltered for a fraction of a second. He took a sip of brandy, his fingers tightening briefly on the glass. "Central? Hardly," he said, waving a hand. "Vaughan was the one skulking here, not me. I was out on the terrace, charming Miss Carrington. Ask her yourself." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the room's details. The library was vast, its tall windows overlooking the gardens, its shelves reaching to the coffered ceiling. A heavy oak desk stood in one corner, its surface cluttered with papers and an inkstand, the pen still wet with use. A safe, discreetly built into the wall behind a portrait of Eleanor's father, caught her attention. Its door was closed, but the faintest scratch on its brass handle suggested recent handling. She thought of a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper whose safe had been tampered with, the marks betraying a thief's haste. A safe, she remarked, almost to herself, must hold many secrets in a house like this. Roland's laugh was a touch too loud. "Secrets? Only dusty ledgers and Eleanor's will, I'd wager. Not my concern." But his eyes flicked to the safe, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, filing it away with the precision of a village gossip. "Sorting rumours." "Eleanor's will," she said, her voice soft as the wool in her hands, "must be a weighty matter for a young woman with such a fortune. You're her cousin, are you not? Her closest kin?" Roland shifted in his chair, his nonchalance fraying. "Closest, yes, but not grasping, if that's what you're hinting. Eleanor's too clever to be caught up in anyone's schemes, mine included." He stubbed out his cigarette, the motion abrupt. "She's probably off on some lark, hiding from all this fuss. She was always headstrong." His words were dismissive, but Miss Marple heard the strain beneath them, like a St. Mary Mead farmer denying debts while his fields lay fallow. "Headstrong," she echoed, her needles pausing. "Yet she seemed troubled at the ball, don't you think?" I noticed her smile wasn't quite herself. Roland's fingers drummed on the armrest, a restless rhythm. Troubled. She was dazzling, as always. If she was off, it's probably Vaughan's doing, always pestering her with legal nonsense. His tone was casual, but Miss Marple caught the edge, the hint of resentment. She recalled Giles's mention of Eleanor's questions about the trusts, questions directed to Vaughan. Roland, she suspected, knew more of those matters than he let on. The library door creaked open, admitting Lady Beatrice, her face pale but resolute. "Jane, I hoped you'd be here," she said, casting a wary glance at Roland, the inspector's in a state, tearing through the servants' quarters. "He's convinced someone's hiding something." Roland snorted, reaching for his brandy. "Harrow's barking up every tree, is he? Let him. He won't find Eleanor in a broom cupboard." Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with a faint smile. "The inspector is thorough," she said, "but sometimes it's the quiet corners that hold the truth." She rose, her knitting tucked away, and approached the desk, her fingers brushing the papers as if by accident. A ledger lay open, its entries meticulous, but a single sheet, half concealed beneath a blotter, bore Roland's initials in a hasty scroll. It was a tally of sums, with words like owed and urgent underlined. Miss Marple did not linger, but her mind seized the detail, like a St. Mary Mead postmistress spotting a letter from a creditor. Roland's debts, she thought, were more than gossip. They were a motive, coiled like a spring. "Mr. Fairchild," she said, turning back to him, "you mentioned Miss Carrington. A charming girl, I'm sure. Was she with you the entire time you were on the terrace?" Roland's eyes narrowed, but his smile held. "Long enough, Miss Marple, long enough to know I wasn't creeping about, kidnapping cousins." His laugh was forced, and Lady Beatrice, hovering near the door, frowned. Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, but her mind was elsewhere, picturing the terrace, its stone balustrade overlooking the dew-soaked gardens. Miss Carrington's hesitation when confirming Roland's alibi had been slight, but telling. Lovers, she knew, could be persuaded to stretch the truth, but only so far. As Lady Beatrice escorted her from the library, Miss Marple glanced back at Roland, who had lit another cigarette, his gaze fixed on the safe. The room, she thought, held more than books. The safe, the ledger, the wet inkstand. They were pieces of a puzzle, and Roland's careless charm was a piece that did not quite fit. She thought of a St. Mary Mead gambler whose debts had led him to theft, his bravado crumbling under scrutiny. Roland, she suspected, was treading a similar path. But whether it led to Eleanor's disappearance was another question. In the corridor, Lady Beatrice clutched her arm. "Jane, Roland's always been reckless, but surely he wouldn't harm Eleanor." Her voice trembled, seeking reassurance. Miss Marple patted her hand, her expression serene. "People, Beatrice, often act out of necessity, not malice. But necessity can be a dangerous thing." She did not mention the ledger, nor the safe, nor the flicker of fear in Roland's eyes. Instead, she thought of the chloroform in Eleanor's room, the single earring, the earth on Giles's boots. The threads were multiplying, but the pattern was still elusive. As they reached the main hall, the manor's clock chimed 3, its notes solemn against the distant clatter of the inspectors' search. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the gardens stretched toward the greenhouse and stables. Roland's debts, Giles's unease, Vaughan's seclusion, Ashby's pristine shoes was a clue, a whisper of intent. She resolved to visit the terrace later, to see what Miss Carrington's eyes might reveal. For now, she returned to her room, her mind as busy as her needles, weaving a tapestry of suspicion that grew clearer with every stitch. Chapter 6. The lawyer's shadow, the late afternoon light, dimmed by the persistent clouds over Greystone Manor. cast a muted glow through the tall windows of the west wing, where Clarence Vaughan's office lay tucked behind a heavy oak door. The room, austere compared to the manor's opulent salons, was a fortress of order, shelves of legal tomes, a mahogany desk polished to a mirror sheen, and a single chair for visitors, as if to discourage lingering. Miss Jane Marple, having parted from Lady Beatrice after their encounter with Roland, had sought out this space, guided by a quiet instinct honed in the drawing-rooms and back gardens of St. Mary Mead. Vaughan, as the steward of Eleanor Fairchild's fortune, held a key to the mystery, and Miss Marple intended to turn it, however gently. She knocked softly, her knitting bag slung over her arm like a shield of innocence. The door opened to reveal Vaughan, his lean frame silhouetted against the desk lamp's glow, his grey eyes sharp as flint. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but edged with caution, "an unexpected visit. I trust you're not lost." His smile was a formality, devoid of warmth, and she noted the way his hand rested on a ledger, as if to guard it from prying eyes. She thought of a St. Mary Mead solicitor who had once hidden a client's misdeeds behind such a smile, his secrets, spilling only when pressed. "Not lost, Mr. Vaughan," she replied, her tone as mild as a summer breeze. "I merely thought to ask about Miss Eleanor's affairs, as Lady Beatrice is so distressed. You manage her trusts, do you not?" She settled into the chair, uninvited but undeterred, her needles emerging with a familiar click. Vaughan's eyes narrowed, but he closed the ledger and sat, his movements precise, like a chess player assessing the board. "I do," he said, folding his hands. "Miss Fairchild's estate is complex land investments, the sapphire mine her father left. I ensure its stability, as I did for her father." His words were measured, but Miss Marple caught the faintest emphasis on stability, as if it were a mantra. She recalled Giles's mention of Eleanor's recent questions about the trusts, and Roland's offhand remark about Vaughan pestering. The lawyer, she sensed, was a man who thrived on control. But control could slip when challenged. "How diligent of you," she said, her needles moving steadily. "Miss Eleanor must rely on you greatly, though I hear she's been curious lately, asking about her accounts." Vaughan's fingers twitched, a fleeting betrayal of his composure. "She's young," he said, his voice cool. "Curiosity is natural, but the trusts are secure. I advised her to focus on her duties as hostess." His dismissal was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the tension in his jaw. Like a St. Mary Mead banker caught fudging figures. She let the silence stretch, her eyes drifting to the desk. A fountain pen lay beside the ledger, its nib stained with fresh ink, and a wastebasket nearby held a crumpled paper, its edge just visible. She thought of the library's inkstand, also wet, and wondered if Vaughan's reviewing documents during the ball had been more urgent than he claimed. Such a responsibility, she mused aloud, managing a fortune. It must require discretion. The word hung between them, and Vaughan's smile tightened, as if she'd tugged a hidden thread. "Discretion is my profession," he said, rising as if to signal the end of the conversation. But Miss Marple, undeterred, leaned forward to adjust her shawl, her hand brushing the wastebasket. The crumpled paper fell to the floor, and she retrieved it with an apologetic murmur. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she said, smoothing it briefly, before returning it to the basket. In that moment, her sharp eyes caught a sketchier rough map, perhaps, with lines suggesting a path from the manor to an unknown point. She thought of the earth on Giles's boots, the chloroform in Eleanor's room, and a new piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Vaughan's gaze followed her movement, his expression unreadable but his posture rigid. "You have a keen eye, Miss Marple," he said, his tone clipped. "But this is a matter for the police, not village curiosity." She smiled, unruffled, her needles pausing. "Of course, Mr. Vaughan, though in my village curiosity often lights the way where lanterns fail." She rose, her knitting tucked away, and thanked him for his time, her mind racing. As she left the office, the manor's corridors felt colder, the portraits of Fairchild ancestors watching her passage with unyielding eyes. She thought of the map, its lines hinting at a route beyond the manor's walls. Vaughan's control, his guarded demeanour, suggested a man with plans, and plans, she knew, could be as dangerous as debts or charm. In St. Mary Mead, a chemist had once hidden a ledger of illicit sales behind a locked drawer, but a careless scrap had undone him. Vaughan, she suspected, was no less careless, despite his precision. She found Lady Beatrice in the morning room, poring over a guest list with Inspector Harrow, who looked as exasperated as ever. "No leads, Miss Marple," he grumbled, tossing a pencil onto the table. "No ransom, no witnesses, just a room that's too blasted clean." Lady Beatrice, her eyes red-rimmed, clutched Miss Marple's arm. "Jane, you spoke to Vaughan. Did he say anything about Eleanor?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing. "Only that he guards her fortune with care. But care, Beatrice, can sometimes hide other motives." She did not mention the map, nor the ink, nor the tension in Vaughan's eyes. Instead, she suggested a walk in the gardens, claiming a need for air. As they stepped outside, the greenhouse loomed in the distance, its glass panes glinting faintly. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the manor's grounds, the paths that might match Vaughan's sketch. She recalled the single earring, the missing gown, the chloroform's acrid trace. The lawyer's shadow, she thought, stretched further than his office, and she would follow it. As she had followed shadows in St. Mary Mead to wherever it led. The manor's clock struck 4, its chimes a solemn reminder of time slipping away. Miss Marple, her shawl drawn close against the chill, resolved to examine the grounds before nightfall. Vaughan's map, if it was a map, was a clue she could not ignore, and the greenhouse, with its hidden corners, called to her like a whisper from the past. For now, she walked with Lady Beatrice, her mind as sharp as her needles, piecing together a mystery that grew darker with every step. Chapter 7. The guest's charm, the twilight air hung heavy over Greystone Manor, the last rays of a reluctant sun painting the gardens in shades of amber and shadow. The guests, still confined to the estate by Inspector Harrow's stern decree, had retreated to their rooms or clustered in anxious knots in the drawing-room, their voices a low hum of speculation. Miss Jane Marple, having parted from Lady Beatrice after their walk, felt the pull of the gardens, where Lord Ashby had claimed to wander during Eleanor Fairchild's disappearance. His alibi, delivered with such effortless charm, had rung false. To her ears, like a St. Mary Mead salesman's tale of honest wares. She slipped out through a side door, her shawl drawn close, her knitting bag a familiar weight on her arm, determined to test the ground where Ashby's story lay. The gardens were a maze of manicured hedges and rose beds, their paths winding toward the distant greenhouse and stables. The grass, still damp from the previous night's dew, glistened underfoot, and Miss Marple's eyes scanned it carefully. Ashby had spoken of admiring roses by moonlight, yet his shoes, when she'd glimpsed them in the drawing-room, bore no trace of moisture or grass. She thought of a St. Mary Mead poacher, whose clean boots had betrayed his lie about a midnight hunt. The gardens, she suspected, held a truth Ashby had not shared. She found him near the fountain, a marble affair where water trickled softly, its sound a counterpoint to the manor's tension. Lord Ashby stood alone, his evening coat immaculate, a cigarette glowing in his hand as he gazed at the darkening sky. His profile, handsome and composed, might have charmed a less discerning eye. But Miss Marple saw the calculation in his posture, the way he turned at her approach, with a smile too quick, too polished. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm, "as brandy, out for an evening stroll. The gardens are quite enchanting, aren't they?" "Quite," she replied, her tone as gentle as a village aunt's, "though I confess, I'm curious about your own stroll last night. The roses, you said." She settled onto a stone bench, her needles emerging with their familiar click, a sound that seemed to disarm even as it probed. Ashby's smile widened, but his eyes held a flicker of wariness, like a St. Mary Mead card sharp, caught with an ace up his sleeve. "Roses, indeed," he said, flicking ash into the fountain. The moonlight was splendid, and the ball, well, it was a bit stifling. I needed air. He gestured toward a nearby rosebed, its blooms drooping under the weight of dew. Miss Marple's gaze followed, noting the path's damp earth unmarked by footprints. "A lovely choice," she said, her needles moving steadily, though the dew must have been heavy. "I noticed the grass was quite wet this morning." Ashby's laugh was light, but his fingers paused on the cigarette. I suppose I kept to the paths, then. Wouldn't do to ruin a good pair of shoes." His tone was casual, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his jaw, a tell she'd seen in a St. Mary Mead merchant who'd lied about his whereabouts during a theft. She smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Very sensible, Lord Ashby. Shoes can be so telling, can't they?" She rose, as if to admire the roses, her steps deliberate as she paced the path. The gravel was firm, but the surrounding grass bore no imprint of a man's tread, not even the faintest crush of blades. She thought of the chloroform in Eleanor's room, the single earring, the earth on Giles's boots, the map in Vaughan's wastebasket. Ashby's charm was a distraction, she suspected, like a conjurer's patter, and she wondered what it concealed. "You're a traveller, I hear," she said, turning back to him. "Such stories you must have. Did you know Miss Eleanor well?" His smile returned, effortless now. "Barely, I'm afraid. I was a guest of her aunt's, invited for the ball. Eleanor was charming, of course, but we only exchanged pleasantries." He stubbed out his cigarette, his movements graceful but deliberate. Miss Marple nodded, her mind sifting his words. His presence at the ball, so late in addition to the guest list, was a puzzle in itself. In St. Mary Mead, a stranger's arrival had once heralded trouble, his charm masking a scheme to swindle the vicar. Ashby, she thought, was no mere drifter, but his purpose remained elusive. As they spoke, a footman approached, summoning Ashby to the drawing-room for another round of Inspector Harrow's questions. "Duty calls," Ashby said, with a mock bow. "A pleasure, Miss Marple." He strode off, his gait confident, but Miss Marple's eyes lingered on his retreating figure, noting the ease with which he moved, as if the manor's shadows held no threat for him. She thought of the greenhouse, visible in the distance, and resolved to visit it soon, its glass panes a beacon in her growing web of clues. She returned to the manor, where Lady Beatrice awaited her in the hall, her face pale under the gaslight. "Jane, the inspector's like a bull in a shop, upsetting everyone," she whispered. "Did you learn anything from Ashby, Miss Marple?" patted her friend's arm, her voice soothing. Only that charm, Beatrice, can be as concealing as a fog. But fogs lift, given time. She did not mention the unmarked grass, nor Ashby's too clean shoes, nor the nagging sense that his presence was no accident. Inside, the drawing room buzzed with tension, the guests' voices sharp as they speculated on Eleanor's fate. Inspector Harrow, red-faced, was questioning Roland again, his patience fraying. Miss Marple settled into a corner, her knitting a shield as she observed. Ashby, now seated near the fireplace, was regaling a group with a tale of Cairo, his laughter, drawing smiles even from the weary, yet his eyes, when they met hers, held a glint of something sharper, like a St. Mary Mead stranger who'd watched her too closely. The manor's clock struck 7, its chimes a solemn note against the chatter. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the greenhouse, the map in Vaughan's office, the earth on Giles's boots. Ashby's charm was a thread in the tapestry, but whether it was woven with guilt or mere opportunism, she could not yet say. She resolved to explore the grounds at dawn, when the manor slept and its secrets lay unguarded. For now, she knitted, her mind as sharp as her needles, tracing the outlines of a mystery that grew more intricate with every hour. Chapter 8. A clue in the greenhouse. The dawn broke over Greystone Manor with a reluctant light. The sky, a patchwork of grey clouds that seemed to press down upon the estate. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fading roses. As Miss Jane Marple stepped into the gardens, her shawl wrapped tightly against the morning chill, the manor behind her slumbered uneasily, its inhabitants bound by Inspector Harrow's orders and the weight of Eleanor Fairchild's absence. Miss Marple, guided by a quiet resolve honed in the lanes of St. Mary Mead, had chosen this hour to explore the greenhouse, a glass structure glinting faintly at the garden's edge, the map in Vaughan's wastebasket, the earth on Giles's boots, and Ashby's unblemished shoes had stirred her curiosity. And the greenhouse, mentioned in passing by a maid as Eleanor's private retreat, beckoned like a half-remembered clue. The path to the greenhouse wound through neatly trimmed hedges, the gravel crunching softly under her sensible shoes. She moved with the deliberate pace of one accustomed to observing, her eyes scanning the ground for signs overlooked by the inspector's heavy-handed search. The grass, still wet with dew, bore no fresh footprints, confirming her suspicion that Ashby's midnight stroll was a fiction. She thought of a St. Mary Mead gardener whose lies about tending roses had unravelled when no petals were found on his coat. Small details, she knew, were the threads that unravelled greater deceptions. The greenhouse loomed ahead, its glass panes misted with condensation, its iron frame weathered but sturdy. The door, slightly ajar, creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a humid world of green. Orchids, Eleanor's pride, bloomed in vibrant rows, their delicate petals a contrast to the manor's sombre mood. The air was thick with the scent of soil and blooms, and Miss Marple's senses sharpened, alert for anything amiss. She moved carefully, her knitting bag slung over her arm, her eyes darting to the corners where shadows lingered. Near a bench strewn with gardening tools, she paused. The soil beneath was disturbed, not in the neat patterns of planting, but in a haphazard scatter, as if someone had trodden carelessly. Kneeling, her knees protesting the effort, she examined the earth and found a torn glove, its leather fine, but frayed at the seam, monogrammed with a faint C. She turned it over, her fingers brushing a trace of white powder that clung to the fabric. A quick sniff confirmed her suspicion. Chloroform, its acrid scent unmistakable, matching the trace in Eleanor's room. She tucked the glove into her reticule, her mind racing. In St. Mary Mead, a dropped handkerchief had once led her to a thief. A glove, she thought, might lead to something graver. Rising, she surveyed the greenhouse further. A row of pots lined the back wall, their soil freshly turned, but one caught her eye, large clay pot, slightly askew, its base resting unevenly. She approached, her heart quickening, and nudged it aside with her foot. Beneath lay a trapdoor, its wood weathered but recently disturbed, a faint scrape mark betraying its use. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The manor, she knew, was riddled with old passages, relics of its storied past. This trapdoor, hidden in Eleanor's sanctuary, suggested a secret kept from even her closest kin. She lifted the trapdoor cautiously, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air below was cool and musty, hinting at a tunnel, long forgotten by the household. She hesitated, aware of her own limitations. Village spinster was no match for damp stone steps, but her curiosity, sharper than any fear, urged her to mark the spot for later. She replaced the trapdoor, ensuring the pot was as she found it, and stepped back, her mind weaving new threads into the tapestry of the mystery. The glove, the chloroform, the trapdoor, they pointed to a plan, deliberate and concealed, but by whom? As she left the greenhouse, the manor's clock struck 6, its chimes faint across the gardens. The grounds were still quiet, but a figure caught her eye near the stable rails, his black livery stark against the dawn, moving with the same purposeful stride she'd noted yesterday. He disappeared behind a hedge, and Miss Marple made a mental note to follow his trail later. The butler's loyalty, she suspected, might bind him to someone other than Eleanor, or to a secret he could not share. Returning to the manor, she found Lady Beatrice in the morning room, her face pale as she clutched a cup of tea. "Jane, you were out so early," she said, her voice trembling. "Have you found anything?" The inspector's no closer to answers. Miss Marple settled beside her, her expression serene. "The gardens are full of surprises, Beatrice," she said, patting her friend's hand. "But surprises, like village secrets, only hide until someone looks closely." She did not mention the glove, nor the trapdoor, nor the chloroform's telltale scent. These were pieces she would hold close, like cards in a St. Mary Mead bridge game, until the moment was right. Inspector Harrow burst in, his mustache bristling with frustration. "Miss Marple, you're up early," he said, his tone more accusation than observation. "Find anything I should know about?" She smiled, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. "Only that the morning air is bracing, Inspector. Though I wonder if you've checked the greenhouse. Miss Eleanor loved her orchids, I hear." Harrow's eyes narrowed, but he waved a hand dismissively. "Flowers won't find her," he muttered, striding off to berate a footman. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the greenhouse stood like a sentinel. The glove's monogram C pointed to Clarence Vaughan, but she knew better than to leap to conclusions. In St. Mary Mead, a monogrammed scarf had once implicated the wrong man, until a maid's confession cleared the truth. The trap door, though, was a new thread, suggesting a hidden exit from the manor, one that might explain Eleanor's silent disappearance. She thought of the map in Vaughan's office, the earth on Giles's boots, Ashby's false stroll. The puzzle was growing, but its shape was beginning to emerge, as Lady Beatrice rose to join the other guests. Miss Marple remained, her knitting a steady rhythm against the morning's quiet. She resolved to explore the trapdoor's tunnel with Inspector Harrow's aid. though she would frame it as a suggestion, not a discovery. For now, she tucked the glove deeper into her reticule, her mind as sharp as the dawn's first light, ready to trace the next clue in Greystone's deepening mystery. Chapter 9. The Tunnel's Secret. The morning mist clung to Greystone Manor's grounds like a veil, softening the edges of the ancient oaks and the distant greenhouse, where Miss Jane Marple had uncovered the hidden trapdoor only hours before. The manor itself seemed to hold its breath, its corridors quiet save for the occasional creak of a floorboard or the muffled voices of Inspector Harrow's men, still combing the estate for signs of Eleanor Fairchild. Miss Marple, her shawl drawn close against the damp, had returned to the main house after her greenhouse discovery, her mind alight with the implications of the chloroform-scented glove and the concealed tunnel. She knew such a find required more than her own exploration. It demanded the inspector's resources, though she would guide him to it with the subtlety of a St. Mary Mead gossip steering a conversation in the morning room, where Lady Beatrice sat with a tray of untouched toast. Miss Marple found Inspector Harrow, his face a thundercloud of frustration. His Sergeant Bates hovered nearby, scribbling notes as Harrow recounted the futility of their latest search. Not a footprint, not a letter, not a blasted clue, he growled, tossing a map of the estate onto the table. It's as if she's vanished into thin air. Miss Marple, settling into a chair with her knitting, offered a gentle smile. Air, Inspector, rarely holds secrets for long. Have you considered the greenhouse? Miss Eleanor's orchids might hide more than beauty. Harrow's eyes narrowed, his moustache twitching with suspicion. The greenhouse. We glanced there, found nothing but flowers. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her voice mild. Perhaps a closer look, near the pots, might reveal something overlooked. Old houses like this have their secrets, don't they? She thought of a St. Mary Mead cottage, where a hidden cellar had concealed a smuggler's cache, discovered only when a child's ball rolled under a loose flagstone. Harrow grunted, but her suggestion, framed as a passing thought, took root. Betts, get a man to check the greenhouse again, he barked. And Miss Marple, stay out of my search. She nodded, her expression serene. But her mind was already tracing the tunnel's possible path. With Harrow's reluctant permission, Miss Marple accompanied a young constable, Willis, to the greenhouse, her presence excused as keeping Lady Beatrice calm. The glass structure was as she'd left it, the orchids vibrant against the grey morning. Willis, a lanky lad with a nervous air, moved the clay pot at her subtle prompting, his eyes widening as the trapdoor came into view. Blimey, ma'am, he whispered, this ain't on the plans. Miss Marple, peering over his shoulder, murmured, old houses, constable, keep their secrets close. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing the same narrow staircase she'd glimpsed earlier, its stone steps descending into a musty darkness. Willis fetched a lantern, and Miss Marple, her heart quickening despite her calm demeanour, followed him down, her hands steady on the iron railing. The tunnel was narrow, its walls damp with age, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. It stretched forward, curving slightly, its purpose unclear, but its recent use evident in the scuff marks on the stone floor. Miss Marple's mind raced, recalling the map in Vaughan's wastebasket, its lines suggesting a path beyond the manor's bounds. The tunnel ended at a wooden door, its hinges rusted but newly oiled, suggesting recent passage. Willis pushed it open, revealing a small, disused cottage at the estate's edge, hidden by overgrown brambles. The single room was sparse a rickety table. A broken chair butt, signs of habitation, caught Miss Marple's eye, a candle stub, its wax still soft, and a woman's scarf, delicate and monogrammed with an E. She bent to examine it, her fingers brushing the silk, confirming it as Eleanor's. A faint smell of chloroform lingered on the fabric, tying it to the glove in her reticule. She thought of a St. Mary Mead barn, where a dropped kerchief had led to a runaway's hiding place, and her pulse quickened. Eleanor had been here, or someone wished it to seem so. Willis, wide-eyed, stammered, "This is something, ma'am. The inspector'll want to see this." Miss Marple nodded, her voice gentle, indeed, "Constable. But let's keep it quiet until he does. Secrets, you know, are easily spoiled." She tucked the scarf into her reticule beside the glove, her mind weaving new connections. The tunnel, the cottage, the scarf, they pointed to a deliberate act. Not a flight, but a captivity, orchestrated with care. The monogrammed glove suggested Vaughan, but the earth on Giles's boots and Ashby's false alibi lingered in her thoughts. Roland's debts, too, hovered like a shadow, each suspect a thread, in a tapestry still incomplete. They returned to the manor, Willis eager to report to Harrow. Miss Marple, trailing behind, paused at the greenhouse door, her eyes scanning the grounds. The stables, where she'd seen Giles hurrying, lay nearby, and she wondered if the tunnel's path intersected with his mysterious errands. Lady Beatrice met her in the hall, her face pale with hope and fear. "Jane, they're saying you found something," she whispered. "Is it Eleanor?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing. "A step closer, Beatrice, but steps must be taken carefully." She did not mention the scarf, nor the cottage, nor the tunnel's silent testimony. Inspector Harrow, summoned to the cottage, arrived with a scowl, his men scouring the room for further clues. "A hideout," he declared, kicking the table. "But no sign of her now. Whoever did this is long gone." Miss Marple, standing quietly, thought otherwise. The candle's soft wax, the scarf's fresh scent, they suggested recent presence, not abandonment. She recalled a St. Mary Mead case, where a stolen bicycle was found in a shed, its tires still warm from use. Eleanor, she suspected, was closer than Harrow believed. As the inspector barked orders, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the manor, where Vaughan's office window glinted in the rising sun. The map, the glove, the tunnel, they pointed to a mind that planned, and Vaughan's cold precision fit the pattern. Yet Giles's unease, Roland's debts, and Ashby's charm remained, each a knot in the mystery. She resolved to watch Vaughan closely, perhaps confronting him with the glove's monogram, though she would do so with the care of a St. Mary Mead spinster navigating village feuds. The manor's clock struck 10, its chimes a solemn reminder of time's passage. Miss Marple returned to her room, her knitting idle as she sat by the window, her reticule heavy with the glove and scarf. The tunnel's secret was a breakthrough, but the truth, she knew, lay in the interplay of motives, greed, loyalty, or something darker. Her mind, as sharp as her needles, turned over the clues, ready to unravel the next thread in Greystone's deepening mystery. Chapter 10. The lawyers gained. The late morning sun struggled through the heavy clouds, casting a pallid light over Greystone Manor's stone facade, where the tension of Eleanor Fairchild's disappearance clung like damp moss. Inside, the manor hummed with the restless energy of confined guests and Inspector Harrow's men, their footsteps echoing as they pursued leads that seemed to vanish like smoke. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl neatly draped and her knitting bag at her side, had retreated to a quiet alcove near the library. her mind alight with the morning's discovery: the tunnel, the cottage, the monogrammed scarf, and the chloroform-scented glove bearing the initial C. These clues pointed to a calculated act, and Clarence Vaughan, the lawyer with his cold precision and guarded office, loomed large in her thoughts. She resolved to confront him, not with accusations, but with the gentle probing she'd perfected in St. Mary Mead, where a single question could unravel a village secret. Vaughan's office door was ajar when she approached, the faint scratch of a pen audible within. She knocked lightly, her demeanor as unassuming as a parish visitor seeking a donation. Vaughan looked up, his grey eyes narrowing as he set down his pen, its nib glistening with fresh ink. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but tinged with irritation, "twice in as many days. To what do I owe this visit?" His hands folded over a ledger, a gesture Miss Marple noted as protective, like a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper guarding a till from curious eyes. "I shan't take much of your time, Mr. Vaughan," she said, settling into the chair opposite his desk, her needles emerging with their familiar click. "I've been thinking about Miss Eleanor's trusts, and how much she relied on your guidance. It must be a heavy burden, managing such a fortune." Her tone was mild, but her words were a needle, probing for a reaction. Vaughan's lips twitched. "Not quite a smile. A burden I'm accustomed to," he replied. "Her father trusted me, as does she. The trusts are secure, despite her recent ... inquisitiveness." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes meeting his. Inquisitiveness. How curious. Mr. Giles mentioned she'd asked about the trusts, and Mr. Fairchild suggested you'd been pressing her with legal matters. It must be trying when a young woman questions what's hers. Vaughan's fingers tightened on the ledger, a fleeting betrayal of his composure. "She's young," he said, his voice clipped. "Youth questions what experience knows best." I assured her all was in order, but his eyes, Miss Marple thought, held the wariness of a St. Mary Mead solicitor caught adjusting a client's accounts. She leaned forward, as if sharing a confidence. "And yet, Mr. Vaughan, strange things happen in ordered houses. A glove, for instance, found in the greenhouse, with a scent of chloroform and a monogram, C, I believe." She watched him closely, her expression serene but her gaze sharp. Vaughan's face remained impassive, but his hand twitched toward a drawer, then stilled. "A glove?" he said, his tone almost amused. "The greenhouse is full of gardener's leavings. As for chloroform, I'm no chemist." His denial was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the faintest tremor in his voice, like a St. Mary Mead banker denying a shortfall. She pressed gently, her needles resuming their rhythm. "And the tunnel, Mr. Vaughan, beneath the greenhouse, did you know of it? It leads to a cottage where a scarf of Miss Eleanor's was found, also scented with chloroform." His eyes flickered, a crack in his armor, and she thought of a village chemist whose composure had broken when confronted with a misplaced vial. "Tunnels are old news in houses like this," he said, rising as if to dismiss her. "As for scarves, the maids are careless. You're weaving fancies, Miss Marple, fancies, perhaps," she said, rising too, her knitting tucked away. "But in my village, small things, glove, a scarf, a map often lead to truths." She paused, her hand brushing the wastebasket where she'd found the crumpled sketch. A map, for instance, might show a path to a cottage. Vaughan's face paled just for a moment before his mask returned. "I deal in contracts, not maps," he said, his voice cold. "If you'll excuse me, I have work." She nodded, thanking him with the courtesy of a St. Mary Mead spinster, but as she left, her mind was ablaze. The glove's monogram, the scarf, the tunnel, they pointed to Vaughan, but his denials were too practiced, his control too rigid. She recalled the St. Mary Mead case, where a lawyer's meticulous records had hidden a fraud, uncovered only when a single receipt surfaced. Vaughan, she suspected, was playing a deeper game, one tied to Eleanor's fortune. In the hall, she met Lady Beatrice, her face drawn with worry. "Jane, the inspectors found nothing in that cottage but dust and a scarf," she said, clutching Miss Marple's arm. "Is there hope?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing. "Hope, Beatrice, lies in the details. A scarf, a glove they speak when we listen." She did not mention Vaughan's reaction, nor the map, nor her growing certainty that Eleanor was not far as she passed the drawing-room. She glimpsed Roland, his brandy glass empty, his eyes darting nervously. Giles, directing a footman, avoided her gaze, his boots now spotless, but his demeanour strained. Ashby, charming a group of guests, caught her eye and offered a nod, his smile as polished as ever. Each man, she thought, was a piece in the puzzle. But Vaughan's shadow loomed largest. His control over the trusts, a motive as potent as Roland's debts or Ashby's secrets. Miss Marple retired to her room, her reticule heavy with the glove and scarf. She sat by the window, her knitting idle, her mind tracing the threads, the chloroform, the tunnel, the cottage, the map. Vaughan's game, she suspected, was one of power, not passion, and Eleanor's disappearance was its opening move. She resolved to share the glove with Inspector Harrow, framing it as a chance find to see how Vaughan reacted under pressure. In St. Mary Mead, a dropped letter had once forced a confession. Here, a glove might do the same. The manor's clock struck noon, its chimes a solemn reminder of time's weight. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the cottage, its candle stub, still soft, suggesting Eleanor's recent presence. The lawyer's game was nearing its end, she sensed, and she, Jane Marple, would be there to see it played out, her mind as sharp as the needles resting in her lap. Chapter 11. The trap is set. The afternoon light waned over Greystone Manor, casting long shadows across the polished floors and tapestried walls, where the air seemed to hum with the weight of unspoken truths. The guests, confined to the estate by Inspector Harrow's relentless investigation, moved like figures in a strained tableau, their whispers sharp with speculation about Eleanor Fairchild's fate. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl neatly draped and her knitting bag a constant companion, sat in the morning-room, her mind weaving the threads of her discoveries: the chloroform-scented glove, monogrammed with a C, the scarf in the cottage, the hidden tunnel, and the map in Vaughan's wastebasket. These clues, like the gossip of St. Mary Mead, pointed to a calculated scheme, and Clarence Vaughan, with his cold precision, stood at its heart. Yet Miss Marple knew that truth, like a shy villager, required coaxing, not force, and she devised a plan to draw it out. She found Inspector Harrow in the hall, his face flushed with frustration as he berated a constable for a poorly dusted fingerprint. "No progress, Miss Marple," he growled, spotting her. That cottage was a dead end, nothing but a scarf and a candle. She nodded, her expression serene, and said, "Perhaps, Inspector, a fresh approach might help. In my village, we once flushed out a thief by spreading word he'd been caught. The guilty always react." Harrow's eyes narrowed, but her mild tone disarmed him. "You're suggesting a trick?" he asked, his mustache twitching. "Exactly," she replied. her needles clicking softly, announce that Eleanor has been found safe and well. Watch the suspects. The one who planned this will falter. Harrow, though skeptical, saw no harm in the ruse. Very well, he said, but don't expect miracles. He strode off to gather the household, leaving Miss Marple to join Lady Beatrice, who clutched her arm with desperate hope. Jane, is it true? Have they found her? Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing. Not yet, Beatrice, but we're close. People, you see, betray themselves when they think the game is up. She thought of a St. Mary Mead poacher who'd confessed when rumour spread of his capture, his nerve breaking under imagined pressure. The drawing room filled with guests, there. Faces a mix of curiosity and dread as Harrow took centre stage, his voice booming. Good news, ladies and gentlemen. Miss Eleanor Fairchild has been found, unharmed, and is being brought back to the manor. A gasp rippled through the room, followed by murmurs of relief. But Miss Marple's eyes were on the four suspects, each a study in reaction. Mr. Giles, standing by the door, stiffened, his hand gripping a tray until his knuckles whitened. Roland Fairchild, lounging near the fireplace, spilled his brandy, his laugh forced as he muttered, "Well, that's a relief." Lord Ashby, seated with a group of ladies, offered a charming smile, but his fingers drummed restlessly on his knee. Clarence Vaughan, near the window, froze, his face a mask, but Miss Marple caught the fleeting panic in his eyes, like a St. Mary Mead solicitor caught in a lie. She leaned toward Lady Beatrice, whispering, "Watch Mr. Vaughan, Beatrice. His calm is too perfect." As the room buzzed with questions, Vaughan excused himself, citing urgent correspondence. Miss Marple, her instincts sharp, nudged Harrow. "Follow him, Inspector, quietly. He may move now, thinking the game is lost." Harrow, though grumbling, signalled Bates to trail the lawyer, and Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her steps light as a village spinster on a parish errand. Vaughan moved swiftly through the corridors, his usual precision fraying as he headed not to his office but to the stables. Miss Marple, lingering near a window, saw him enter, his movements hurried. She thought of the cottage, the tunnel, the scarf clues that suggested Eleanor was near, perhaps still within reach. Harrow and Bates, emerging from the shadows, followed. Vaughan into the stables, and Miss Marple, her heart quickening, slipped out to the grounds, circling toward the cottage she'd found via the tunnel. The cottage, hidden by brambles, was as she'd left it, its door slightly ajar. Inside, a faint sounder muffled sob confirmed her suspicions. She pushed open the door, her eyes adjusting to the dimness, and saw Eleanor Fairchild bound to a chair, her auburn hair dishevelled but her spirit unbroken. "Miss Marple," she gasped, her voice hoarse. He said he'd kill me if I didn't sign." Before Miss Marple could respond, Harrow and Bates burst in, dragging a struggling Vaughan, his composure shattered. "It's over, Vaughan," Harrow barked as Bates untied Eleanor. Vaughan's eyes, wild now, met Miss Marple's. "You meddling old woman," he spat, but she only smiled, her expression serene. "In my village, Mr. Vaughan, meddling often finds the truth." She produced the glove from her reticule, its monogram gleaming. "This, and your map, told quite a story." Vaughan's shoulders slumped, his game undone. Eleanor, freed, clutched Miss Marple's hand, her eyes brimming with gratitude as Harrow led Vaughan away. Miss Marple remained with Eleanor, her mind piecing together the final threads. The lawyer's plan to force Eleanor's signature, securing her fortune through legal deceit, the tunnel as his secret route, the chloroform to subdue her. Giles's unease, Roland's debts, and Ashby's charm had been distractions, but Vaughan's greed was the heart of it. She thought of a St. Mary Mead swindler, unmasked by a single, careless letter, and knew the truth was always in the details. The manor's clock struck 3, its chimes a note of resolution. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, prepared to return to the house, her work nearly done. The trap had been set, and the truth, like a St. Mary Mead secret, had come to light. Chapter 12. The Heiress returns. The twilight settled over Greystone Manor like a soft curtain, the sky bruised with clouds that softened the sharp edges of the estate's ancient stone. The tension that had gripped the household for days began to unravel, replaced by a cautious relief as Eleanor Fairchild, pale but resolute, was escorted back to the manor by Inspector Harrow and his men. The guests, gathered in the great hall, murmured in hushed awe, their eyes following the heiress. As she stepped inside, her auburn hair catching the flicker of the chandeliers, Miss Jane Marple, seated by the fireplace with her knitting, observed the scene with quiet satisfaction, her needles idle for once. The puzzle, intricate as any she'd faced in St. Mary Mead, had been solved, though the final threads needed weaving before the tapestry was complete. Eleanor, supported by Lady Beatrice, whose face was a mix of joy and exhaustion, sank into a chair, her hands trembling but her gaze steady. "I'm safe," she said, her voice soft but firm, addressing the assembled crowd. "Thanks to Miss Marple and the inspector." The guests' whispers swelled, some offering congratulations, others casting wary glances at Clarence Vaughan, who stood in the corner, handcuffed and silent, his once impeccable demeanour shattered. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as ever, noted the reactions. Mr. Giles, his rigid posture softened by relief. Roland Fairchild, his brandy glass forgotten, his face a mask of uneasy gratitude. Lord Ashby, his charm subdued, offering a nod that seemed more respectful than calculated. Inspector Harrow, his moustache bristling with newfound authority, cleared his throat. Mr. Vaughan kidnapped Miss Fairchild, intending to force her to sign over control of her estate. We found her in the cottage, thanks to Miss Marple's persistence. His tone held a grudging respect, and Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. She thought of a St. Mary Mead constable who'd once scoffed at her insights, only to rely on them when a thief was caught. Harrow, she suspected, was learning the value of a village spinster's eye. Lady Beatrice, clutching Eleanor's hand, turned Miss Marple. "Jane, how did you know? That glove, the tunnel, how did you piece it together?" The room quieted, all eyes on Miss Marple, who set her knitting aside, her voice as gentle as a vicar's at tea. "People, Beatrice, are much like those in my village. They plan, they scheme, but they leave traces, small things, like a glove, or a map, that speak louder than words." She recounted the clues, the chloroform sent in Eleanor's room, the single earring, the missing gown, the earth on Giles's boots, the map in Vaughan's wastebasket, the glove in the greenhouse, the scarf in the cottage. Each, she explained, was a thread, and Vaughan's greed had woven them into a noose. Eleanor spoke, her voice gaining strength. "Mr. Vaughan came to my room during the ball, saying he needed my signature on a trust document. I trusted him, but then ... double quotes, she faltered, her hand touching her throat. "I smelled something sharp and woke in that cottage, bound. He said he'd keep me there until I signed, or worse." Her eyes met Miss Marple's, gratitude mingling with resolve. You saved me. Miss Marple shook her head, her smile humble. You saved yourself, my dear, by staying strong. I only listened to what the manor told me. She thought of a St. Mary Mead girl, kidnapped by a spurned suitor who'd held her nerve until rescue. Came Eleanor's courage, she knew, had kept her alive. Harrow, eager to assert control, detailed Vaughan's scheme, using the tunnel to spirit Eleanor away, planning to manipulate her fortune through forged documents. The glove, dropped in haste, and the map, carelessly discarded, had been his undoing. Giles's loyalty, Roland's debts, and Ashby's charm, Miss Marple noted, had been mere distractions, though each had played a part in muddying the waters. Giles, she suspected, had seen Vaughan near the greenhouse, but stayed silent out of misplaced duty. Roland's debts had made him a suspect, but his carelessness was no match for Vaughan's calculation. Ashby, an opportunist, had likely sensed trouble but kept his distance, his charm a shield rather than a weapon. As the guests dispersed, some to pack, others to toast Eleanor's return, Miss Marple lingered by the fire, Lady Beatrice at her side. Jane, you're a marvel, Beatrice said, her voice warm. You see what others miss. Miss Marple's eyes crinkled. In St. Mary Mead, Beatrice, people are much the same: greed, fear, loyalty, they all leave marks. Vaughan's mistake was thinking his were hidden. She thought of a village swindler, unmasked by a misplaced receipt, and knew the manor's secrets were no different. The clock struck 8, its chimes a note of closure. Eleanor, now resting upstairs, would recover, her fortune secure. Vaughan, led away by Harrow, faced justice, his plans undone by a spinster's quiet persistence. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her reticule light without the glove and scarf, now in Harrow's custody. As she prepared to retire, her mind was calm, the puzzle solved, the heiress returned. Greystone Manor, like St. Mary Mead, had yielded its secrets to those who looked closely, and Miss Marple, with a final stitch, tied off the thread of another mystery.